Hi, it's Tim Constantine from the Capitol Hill Show. This week we're in New York City. The United Nations General Assembly has its 80th meeting this week. It's the whole world gathered in one place, 193 different countries all getting together. They're airing their complaints, they're airing their concerns, they're sharing praise in some cases for one another. Leaders are all having a conversation all in one place. Much of the world is focused on the war between Russia and Ukraine. This war has been going on almost 4 years, and the whole world is focused trying to figure out how long will it go, how will it end. And while the whole world is focused on it, if you're from the Baltic nations, it is of particular concern. We sit down today with the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Poland. We'll talk about Russia invading their airspace. We'll talk about the NATO response to their call for Article 4, and we'll talk about much more. Thanks very much for doing this with us.
My pleasure.
About a week before Russia invaded Ukraine, I sat down with the ambassador from Lithuania. We were speculating, but there was a fairly safe assumption that danger was ahead, and she cried. She was concerned to the point of tears. When we talk about the Poles, or we talk about Lithuanians, or anyone in the region, the fear is very real when we talk about Russia. For someone who's too young to remember, explain why that is.
I had a similar experience at that time. I was at the Munich Security Conference where there was a sizable Ukrainian delegation. It was feared that President Zelensky might not even make it. He made it. He brought a group of parliamentarians, and people were telling them, don't worry, you've already achieved a moral victory. They can't possibly be invading. And I told them they're invading, and they're invading next week. And it's what you do that will determine how this rolls out. People assume that you will cave, but if you fight, you will get assistance. And that's more or less what happened. So yes, in our part of the world, we live with the stories of our parents and grandparents. You mentioned Lithuania. Yesterday at the Security Council, it was called by Estonia. These were countries whose populations were summarily exiled to Siberia. The Russians would come in 1940s and literally take away 10% of the population and put them in concentration camps. You don't forget that. So we have learned over 500 years that when the Russians threaten us, we believe them.
About 2 weeks ago, Russians were in Poland's airspace.
Yep.
Tell me what happened on that initial run.
So for the first time in decades, our Air Force was literally fighting. The head of the Polish armed force was getting a confirmation from the Prime Minister and the President that he may use lethal power. What happened was that the Russians launched 21 drones from one location, launched them directly at Poland. They traversed Belarus, and they spread around Poland. Some of them fell down, some of them were shot down by Polish and allied F-16s and F-35s. They were not armed, they had extra fuel tanks, and the engagement lasted for 7 hours. So it was not an accident. It was a planned provocation to test our systems, both military, political, and alliance systems. We feel we've won, but we also have learned that we need a Ukrainian-style system for dealing with drones, with electronic anti-drone measures and with physical anti-drone measures, because dealing with a drone from an F-35 is not cost-effective.
This scenario is exactly what NATO was created for.
Indeed.
And yet, it's been a long, long time since there's been any call for NATO. Tell me about the decision to call Article 4.
Article 4 is called when an ally feels threatened but not yet attacked. And we called for it after this incident. Estonia called for it after 3 Russian MiG-31s breached their airspace for 12 minutes. Previously, it was invoked by Turkey when there were threats to it from Syria, and it usually resulted, actually in each case, this time too, in strengthening the particular allies' air defenses. And we are very pleased with the pledges and the actual aircraft and kit that we have received from allies. As to Article 5, which is when you are attacked, as you know, it's only being invoked once in defense of the United States after 9/11, and we rallied round and we sent troops with you to Afghanistan.
In more recent days, Russia has just been pounding Ukraine along that western border near Poland. How close is too close for you?
Well, there are parts of Poland where we can hear Russian bombs, Russian drones falling on Ukraine. The Russian tactics of hitting Ukrainian cities with these Shahed drones, with cruise missiles, with ballistic missiles, is meant to intimidate, but it's having the opposite effect. You know, the British were not intimidated by the Blitz. This is not as intense, in fact. You just need to go to Kiev, where I was 10 days ago. It's a huge city, 3.5 million. So if they kill 2 people or even a dozen people in a night, it doesn't shut down the city. And my impression is just it stiffens Ukrainian resistance.
You mentioned Estonia a minute ago, and Estonia had a similar issue with Russia, and which makes me ask, I guess, a broader question, and that is, when we see Russia going into Estonian airspace, when we see them going into Polish airspace, when we see these continued provocations, what's the objective? What are they looking at in the big picture?
This is an excellent question, and it's a question I ask myself. If you want to win in Ukraine, surely you would want to be studiously peaceable towards other NATO allies. Because if you annoy them with these provocations in the air, if you send assassins, if you do arsons, inevitably what happens is that people get concerned and they rally around the victim of aggression, which is exactly what's happened.
Let's talk on a more personal level. The people of Poland. It's been a generation. You talked about how people have to know from their parents or grandparents the history, and yet it's stamped right there. If you travel through Poland, if you travel through many of the countries, you can see the imprint that communism had there. So what's the feel among the people of Poland right now? As this hovers just off the border, is there fear? Is there anger? Is there resentment? All of the above, maybe?
What we see Russians do in the occupied territories of Ukraine, stealing children, killing members of the administration, teachers, drafting people forcibly into the Russian army, Russifying public administrations and school, brainwashing people. What we see is ourselves in the 1940s and 50s when we were Sovietized by the Soviet Union. And we have told ourselves, never, ever again. We'll do whatever it takes to prevent that from happening again. And this is why we listened to President Trump in his first term when he said, you need to spend more on defense. We doubled our spending then, and we have doubled yet again. In proportion to GDP, we spend more than the United States, and we'll do whatever it takes for them not to dominate us again.
You mentioned not being intimidated and how the Brits historically were not intimidated. The United States, every country likes to think we're strong. We will stand up to anything. The truth is, people are proud, people are attached to their own nation, wherever that is. You hear Trump say America first, but it should be Poland first for the people of Poland. It should be Britain first for the people of the UK.
But we've also joined for common defense, and values have to be backed up by force. And you don't win wars with GDP. You win wars with armies. So you need to write the contracts and you need to produce the stuff. And you also need to learn the lessons from Ukraine, because the Ukrainians are now the best army on our side in drone warfare and in resisting Russia.
You and I both talked just before we began the interview about having a pretty good idea before the invasion happened in Ukraine that it would happen. Are you surprised at all how well Ukraine has stood up to Russia during this almost 4-year period?
Yes, I am. Because before the war, I asked our generals and American generals how many of their brigades would fight. And they said maybe half of them. And in reality, all of them have fought. And you know, Ukraine has 110 brigades under arms. But I'll tell you more. If you'd asked me what the reaction of Western Europe and of the United States would be, I would have been concerned. Actually, Europe has stood the test, and the United States too. So Putin massively miscalculated. He thought he had another paid agents inside the European Union who would block any political activity. He thought he would win in 3 days and it'll be over. And, you know, he's trying to conquer Donbas for 10 years already, this small province, and he still hasn't conquered Donbas.
Let me read this part to you. There was a UK publication that reported this week that a, quote, senior Russian military official, which is allegedly a one-star major general who has defected, says Russia is planning a gray zone attack on Poland before Christmas. A calibrated attack, being planned out, non-nuclear, but it is intended to test NATO's response. Have you heard that? And do you have intelligence relating to that? And what would you expect NATO's response to be if there is indeed an actual calibrated attack on the people of Poland?
Well, even on our own, we have the largest land army in Western Europe now, 300,000. We have more tanks than Germany, France, and Britain put together. We are buying more Abramses from the United States, Apaches. We already have F-16s. We are in the process of acquiring F-35s. We are even buying some high-tech balloons for observation. You know? So we think we'll know if and when it's coming. Look, our constitution says that the Polish army defends Poland, and nobody has absolved us from that. But NATO has stood the test. We expect our allies to rally around this time. And, you know, if Russia can't conquer Donbas, let alone all of Ukraine, I don't expect them to win in a confrontation with NATO. And I hope Russian generals know that.
I guess that's the logical question is, if you can see that, and I can see that, and the world can see that, surely the Russian military complex sees that.
But when you are in authoritarian power for 20 years, like Putin, you are surrounded by yes men, by people who don't want to upset you with bad news, who are probably telling you that your position is much stronger than it in fact is.
Just to follow up on that other one, do you have any intel? Are you aware of any intel that talks about a specific attack on Poland?
We do contingency plans. You know, at NATO, we plan for every eventuality, and we can imagine what those scenarios are. And we don't not only plan them, we exercise them. We've just had a Belarusian Zapad exercise, and it's an aggressive scenario. They would probably like to link up with the Russian exclave in Kaliningrad. They are exercising the attack, we are exercising the defense.
Let's talk, you mentioned the Brits, or you mentioned others who have come, and I'm just looking at the list, the Italians, the French, the Germans, the Swedes, the Danish. Everyone, as you would hope, is participating in this process, in air defense, whether that's in Estonia, whether that's in Poland.
By attacking Ukraine, Putin has made Russia more vulnerable strategically. NATO has acquired 2 new, very capable allies, Sweden and Finland, so that the Baltic Sea is now virtually an internal NATO sea. The border with Finland alone is 1,500 kilometers, which stretches Russian capabilities. Putin is not a great strategist.
Which takes me back, and we kind of touched on this before, but what's the objective? We always hear Putin is an old KGB guy. He wants to put the band back together. He wants to get the old
I'm glad you say that, because there's some people also in this country who see him as a great Christian leader. Give me a break. He's a KGB colonel.
Is there a scenario by which he is able to reassemble parts of the old Soviet Union?
I think he thought there was. He thought that he had an operation in Kiev, a coup that would coincide with his invasion. And he also thought, he believed in his own propaganda, that Ukrainians were just sort of misled Russians, and that if he captures Kiev, they will all come out and express their true pro-Russian feelings. And I think it was a very unpleasant surprise for him to see that Ukrainians not only regard themselves as a separate nation, but that they are willing to die and to kill for being Ukrainian and for being a democracy that is free to integrate with the West.
The whole world is gathered in New York City at the United Nations this week. This is the dominant topic. How productive will this week be as far as your communication with other nations? I'm sure it goes on all the time anyway, but this week is unique. How productive is United Nations Week in a scenario like this?
Well, this is the world's agora. The whole world comes to New York, and this is a place where you can state your message in a way that people will hopefully absorb. The world is immersed in disinformation. Authoritarians spend billions of dollars on literally cognitive assault on our brains through social media. And so this is the place where you can straighten things out, where you can call a spade. And I try to do that in my speeches, either at the Security Council, and today our president will speak at the General Assembly.
None of us have a crystal ball, but we talked about your time as a journalist in the old days, in a previous life, and that you had a great track record. You would study information, you would lay out scenarios, and frankly, you had a very good track record of seeing what may happen a step ahead.
Thank you.
With that in mind, where does this go from here? Is there an end in sight to the Russia situation? And if so, how does that unfold?
So the Ukrainians are planning to fight at least another 3 years. And my working assumption would be that this war will end not like the Second World War, but like the First World War, when one side, hopefully Russia, runs out of resources. And in this context, Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries, which are legitimate military targets, are being very successful. And so if Russia, Putin or someone after Putin finally concludes that they cannot conquer Ukraine at an acceptable cost, not only would Ukraine become a free country able to join the European Union, for example, but I would expect there to be reforms in Russia itself. You know, there is all this talk about how Russia never loses wars. Actually, they've lost plenty of wars. They've lost the Crimean War in the 19th century. They've lost the Russo-Japanese War. They were knocked out of World War I. They lost the invasion of Poland. They lost the invasion of Afghanistan, and they lost the Cold War. And after every defeat, there was reform. And in fact, Russia only reforms itself after a lost war. And that's what this is my sincere good wish for the people of Russia.
If Putin goes away, does Russia's resolve to continue this assault go away?
When you look at the history of colonial wars, they usually last a decade, and they usually only end when the elite of the metropolis concludes that it's unwinnable, and usually when there is a different team. Because it's very difficult for a leader to admit to a catastrophic mistake. We have no control or influence over that, but hopefully Russia will finally conclude that Europe's last empire cannot be rebuilt.
Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.